Hello and welcome. I'm Elaine Watson with AgFunder News, and I'm delighted to be joined by Bruce Friedrich, who is president and founder of the Good Food Institute. We are here to talk about your new book, Meat, which I'm going to bring up now. There we go. So this is available, of course, in all good bookstores, Amazon, and you can also find out the details at meatbook.org. I think you make a pretty compelling case that animal agriculture is inefficient, and it's bad for the environment and so on. But you're also pretty clear-eyed about the fact that simply trying to persuade consumers to eat less meat or switch to alternatives isn't a super effective strategy. Your argument has always been that people might love meat, but they don't necessarily love industrialized animal slaughter. So if we can get to a tipping point for meat alternatives, if they can reach taste and price parity, that then we can move the needle. I guess my question is, what is the roadmap, for getting there? Before any challenger brands have the scale to compete with a mature industry on price, don't they have to offer something better or more compelling so that they can charge a premium in the short term? How are we going to get from A to B to that tipping point?
Yeah, I think we're on the path to that tipping point now. And it's been interesting to see some very creative solutions recently. But it is still the case that globally sales of plant-based meat, they're not rising as much as they were, but they're rising as the products get better. I think we will continue to see that happen as the products get better and better. It's also the case that Impossible Foods is continuing to introduce new products. So it's interesting to me to think about the fact that just 3 or 4 years ago, when Food System Innovations, which is now rolled out its Nectar project, when they did analysis of all of the top plant-based meats, the only one that satisfied meat eaters was the Impossible Burger. And then second place was the Beyond Burger. And on a scale of 1.0, which is to say 1.0 means the meat eater liked it as much as conventional meat, the best that chicken could do was about 0.6. The best that a hot dog could do was about 0.4. We now have chicken nuggets, hot dogs, and I think there are 4 products that people who enjoy meat really like. And then about 14, I think it is, that people who like meat, most people who like meat, like them as much or almost as much as their counterparts. So, I think the strategy is continue to lean in on the health benefits of the products, continue to lean in on the other, the secondary drivers, and continue to make more delicious products. But when people are asked both, A, why have you not tried plant-based meat yet? 2 reasons are, I don't think they're going to taste good, and they're too expensive. And when people are asked, the people who have tried them and stopped eating them, why did you stop eating them? The top 2 reasons are they don't taste good enough and they're too expensive. So I think we need to lean in on those innovations on the plant-based side. And the cultivated side, also a brand new innovation. Cultivated meat 10 years ago, there had been no announced fundraising rounds at all on cultivated meat. It was, I think, roughly February 10th, 2016, that Upside Foods, then Memphis Meats, announced that they had raised just north of $3 million for their seed round. First time in all of human history, roughly 10 years ago, that a cultivated meat company existed at all. And Most Meat just announced that the cost of their burger from prototype is down by a factor of 100,000. So it's down 99.999% in cost, which is pretty remarkable for about a decade. So I think the things are moving in the right direction.
Going back, you talked about how Impossible and Beyond scored pretty well in those kind of consumer surveys, but isn't the fact that Impossible is now partnering with Equi on these high protein pastas and breads, and Beyond Meat's now launched into the sparkling beverage aisle, isn't that kind of a sign that maybe they don't see displacing animal meat as the path to commercial success, in the current climate? Doesn't it seem more like an acknowledgement that Americans want more protein, but not necessarily in the form of plant-based meat?
I mean, I see impossible going into other high protein foods and beyond going into beverages and
Mhm.
outside foods, spinning out a B2B cell culture media company and Vow Marketing Pharmaceuticals, Vow,
Mhm.
the Australian cultivated meat
Yes.
company.
Mhm.
I see that all as a really good sign.
Mhm.
If the goal, the goal is, so I shouldn't say
Mhm.
if the goal is,
Mhm.
the goal is to bring down prices, and you bring down
Yes.
prices by ramping up volume.
Yes.
So
Mhm.
if Impossible and Beyond and Upside and Vow,
Mhm.
if they can market other things that are
Mhm.
higher value, more expensive,
Mhm.
in order to ramp up production
Mhm.
of their core product,
Mhm.
and that's another
Mhm.
fantastic way to ramp up volume, bring down prices for the core
Mhm.
product, for the plant-based meats and the cultivated meats as well. So I see that as a fantastically positive sign.
So going back to where, how we're going to get to this tipping point. So you talked about sort of building volumes, economies of scale, and so on. You've talked about in the cultivated meat space, technologies, advancements that are going to bring down the cost and so on. But what about, do you think a tipping point could ultimately come from higher meat prices driven by, who knows, a new pandemic, zoonotic diseases, or other factors that might push up prices? Or is it unhelpful to sort of hope that something like that is going to happen to change the equation?
Well, I mean, I definitely would not hope for higher prices
Sure, sure.
consumers.
Mhm.
I'm also not a big fan of hope as a strategy. So I will say that for 30 years, people in meat reduction advocacy have
Mm.
been claiming that the world cannot produce more meat,
Yes.
and
Yeah, and we've not seen that. Yeah.
probably for longer than that. I mean, I
Yes.
remember in 2006, Livestock's
Mm.
Long Shadow, the FAO
Mm.
report came out. It said
Mm.
that animal agriculture is one of the top three causes of all of the
Mm.
worst environmental harms.
Mhm.
Um, we're now producing 40% more meat than we were
Yes.
20 years ago when that came out.
Mhm. Yeah.
We've gone from 266 million metric tons to 370
Mhm.
million metric
Mhm.
tons. So
Mhm.
the amount of land, the amount of
Mhm.
grain, the amount of water, the amount of pesticides and
Mhm.
herbicides, and
Mhm.
it looks like this.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
you look at something like the World Resources Institute report, what they
Mhm.
say is that in 2050, on our current trajectory, unless
Mhm.
we have significant crop productivity gains,
Mhm.
there
Mhm.
will be no forests or savannas left.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
but that is what
Mhm.
meat demand and markets lead
Mhm.
to.
Mhm.
So certainly we shouldn't do that.
Mhm.
But I'm not sure that there are actual practical
Mhm.
constraints.
Mhm.
And similarly, sure, the food supply is incredibly fragile. But my goodness, I mean, we made it through COVID. We made it through the initial shock of grain production in Ukraine suddenly being
Mhm.
off of global markets. Global agriculture continues to make it through. So,
Mhm.
maybe that could be I mean, my entire chapter 4 is about the
Mhm.
possibility of significantly more impactful pandemic that could happen.
Mhm.
Chapter 9 and 10 talk about the
Mhm.
fragility of the current supply chain,
Mhm.
um, all of the extra stages of production, all of the other dependencies. So sure, those things could create shocks
Mhm.
that make alternative proteins more competitive because conventional proteins go up in price.
Mhm.
Um, but I don't think we can count on that.
You know that government funding has helped lots of industries, whether it's space exploration, renewable energy, EVs and so on. What evidence do you have that the Trump administration has any interest in funding, an alt meat moonshot?
Well, in 2019,
Mhm.
it had been about 15
Mhm.
years since there
Mhm.
had been a significant government investment
Mhm.
in cultivated meat. The
Mhm.
last one was, I think, 2005 or 2007. The Dutch government, which became that
Mhm.
burger that Mark Post made, paid
Mhm.
for by Sergey Brin, and then became the company Mosa Meat. And the Trump administration, the National Science Foundation under Donald Trump,
Mhm.
put more than $3 million into a cultivated meat project at UC Davis.
Mhm.
Also, at about that same time, it was Donald Trump's Secretary of Agriculture, Sonny Perdue, and Donald Trump's FDA commissioner, Scott Gottlieb, that created the regulatory path that allowed the United States to be the second country in the history of the world to approve cultivated meat for sale. And interestingly, during the Biden administration, there were two companies that had new products approved over the course of 4 years. In about 90 days, the second Trump administration had already crashed through that in terms of approvals. Similarly, if you look at something like the Bipartisan Biotechnology Commission, which involves Senator Todd Young from Indiana on the Republican side, Representative Stephanie Bice from Oklahoma on the Republican side, and then Ro Khanna and Alex Padilla on the Democratic side. It includes alternative proteins explicitly in the proposal. So I'm not sure it's a top priority for the Trump administration.
That doesn't, I mean, regulatory approvals or a small bit of money here and there. I mean, that doesn't really amount to pumping tens of millions or billions of dollars of the moonshot, does it?
It doesn't, which is one of the reasons that it's very exciting to see Korea, Japan, Israel, Singapore, the UK, Germany, Brazil, India, lots of other countries around the world that are taking the opportunity of alternative proteins super seriously. And then we see organizations like the Center for Strategic and International Studies. They released a 4,500-word report, The Opportunity of Alternative Proteins. They frame it in terms of economic competitiveness and national security. And they say the U.S. government should prioritize alternative proteins alongside things like advanced chips for AI and biopharma. And of course, CSIS is one of the most renowned think tanks in the world for national security and extraordinarily bipartisan. I'm my first choice for the person to write the foreword for my book was Caitlin Welsh, who is the director of global food and water security over there at CSIS. She was about 5 years, I think, in the Obama administration, and then all of the first Trump administration. She was at the National Security Council, and I'm incredibly gratified that she did write the book. So, we'll see, but we continue to be optimistic about working with the Trump administration on alternative proteins, and we have a lot of Republican as well as Democratic supporters for what it is that we're trying to do, including the conventional meat industry, the Tyson and Cargill, the two meat companies.
I was going to ask you about that, because most of the big meat companies, I've been writing about this space for several years, and a few years ago, all of the big meat companies were investing heavily in alternative proteins, whether it was pumping money into some of the cultivated meat companies, whether it was setting up, creating their own, ranges of plant-based meat products, some of them setting up, separate divisions, JBS and so on. And they were positioning themselves as, protein companies or protein agnostic. They just want to make money. They're not necessarily concerned about where the protein source is. Saw the same thing with big oil companies a few years ago, investing in, algae biofuels and so on. But, many of these companies have now pulled back because it isn't paying off. What is going to change their minds?
I mean, all of the companies have protected their equity in the cultivated meat companies that they've invested in. So I'm not aware of any company that has actually pulled back.
I'm talking about companies like JBS. It set up a separate plant-based meats division and then pulled that pretty abruptly because it wasn't making any money. So,
well, and then they bought Vegetarian Butcher, which I think is the most widely distributed and performs the best in taste tests plant-based meat company in Europe. And they ramped up production of their plant-based meat products in Brazil, supplying all of the grocery stores in Brazil, supplying Burger King in Brazil, et cetera. So, yeah, I mean, you can't expect companies to make decisions that are bad business decisions, obviously.
Yes.
But I mean, it was 2004, so not that long ago, that board member John Randall Tyson at the Concordia Summit, so September of, not quite, maybe less than 2 years ago, he said, Tyson, we see alternative proteins as the next frontier. So I don't know. I mean, I don't expect them to do things that make a bad, that are bad decisions for their bottom line. But at the end of the day, the inefficiencies of cycling crops through animals that make them so environmentally problematic, that cause them to drive hunger, malnutrition, are also a massive business opportunity. We've been doing this for 12,000 years. It makes no sense. It's inefficient. If we can update, it's going to be also a more profitable way to make meat. So the companies are not, they're not like going out of their way to make something happen that is difficult, but they are certainly continuing to be supportive, to invest, and to see it as a real opportunity, because it is one.
You placed at the GFI a lot of faith in science for solving, the old meat taste and texture problem. So looking at the kind of the plant-based space to start with, we can now genetically engineer microbes to produce, animal proteins, things like myoglobin or animal fats or animal-like fats, that you can then add these things to extruded plant proteins and have a more kind of meaty product and so on. But the closer you get to sort of animal meat, the more processed some of these products might appear. And isn't that a kind of challenge in the current environment? We've got the new dietary guidelines that explicitly talk about highly processed foods, possible federal definition of ultra processed foods coming up, which may result in, who knows, warning labels or rankings or some kind of front of pack labeling. If science is the answer, are the products that we're going to end up with are going to be further away from what consumers, or at least, the current administration says people want?
Yes, in the United States, and to some degree in Europe, not really anywhere else in the rest of the world, there's the ultra processed sort of grouping of all of the products together. And I guess the first thing to say about that is that all of the science indicates that plant-based meats are healthier than the products they're replacing, including the unprocessed burgers or unprocessed other meats. They have less fat, they have less saturated fat, they have no cholesterol, they have more fiber, they have more protein. Across all of the plant-based products in that Nectar study that I was mentioning, that meat eaters like the best. The Impossible hot dog has 3 times as much protein as a beef hot dog. And all of the products have more of those essential nutrients. When you look at what the things are about ultra processing that make them problematic, it tends to be sugar and fat and caloric density. Like that's what Kevin Hall, formerly from NIH, who did the formative Hall study, that's what he said. It's caloric density. And the plant-based meats are less calorically dense. There was a peer review study done from Stanford Medical School, a guy named Christopher Gardner. He fed people Beyond Meat, pork, beef, and chicken, and then organic pork, beef, and chicken. And go on to Beyond products, predictably, said something like, laughingly, yes, you feed somebody something that's lower in saturated fat, lower in cholesterol, higher in fiber, higher in protein. Of course, you're going to have better.
But I'm not making the argument there's anything wrong with these products or saying there's anything wrong with processing per se. And this is a war of perception, isn't it? And at the moment, I think the industry is probably losing it. And with these new dietary guidelines, for example, that the slogan is "Eat real food." Dietary guidelines suggest that people should be eating more protein. Is that good news for the alt meat industry, or potentially bad news? Because at least in terms of the graphics and so on, the focus appears to be on a slab of meat, very much sort of meat and dairy proteins at the fore.
Well, I do want to just take a step back and say it is still true that all of the polls that have been done ever of why people are not eating plant-based meat or why they stopped eating plant-based meat, the top 2 causes are still taste and price. They didn't like them and they're too expensive. Processing has inched up, but it's still a gap between those 2 and processing. My hypothesis would be that regardless of ultra processing, you're still not going to get significant penetration unless you get price and taste metrics.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you. And obviously there are many products that we eat every single day that are ultra processed, but if people like them, they taste good, and they're delivering a benefit that people perceive, then absolutely they'll buy them. So I agree with you completely on that. I'm just thinking more about if we get going forward, for example, front of pack labeling around processed foods, fairly or otherwise, how are these products going to be
I don't think it's going to matter. I mean, people are not like surprised to learn that Doritos and Coca-Cola are unhealthy.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think the people who are most educated, once the products taste better and cost less, they will switch over because they're educated people. Until that happens, they're not going to switch over. And then everybody else will eat them because they're delicious and affordable.
Okay, let's talk about money. So since you wrote Meat, Believer Meats has become insolvent. Meatables called it quits. Good Meat seems to have hit pause as it's focusing more on its Just Egg business. Upside has kind of retrenched a little bit. Multiple firms have gone bust. Many of the companies I cover are kind of, I would say, effectively in hibernation mode if they haven't gone bust already. I agree media costs are coming down. We've got some interesting technologies around new bioreactors, sterilization techniques. But private sector funding has almost dried up. And yeah, you say in some markets, that people are recognizing that this technology could be important for food security and so on. But right now, money is almost dried up in this market. What's going to bring it back?
I think we are seeing it start to come back. So Better Meat Company just raised, I think, $30-something million. Blue Nalu and Masse just raised $11 million and $17 million, I think it was. We have seen government support go up literally every single year since governments started funding in this space. And I think it's worth thinking about just this is what an innovation ecosystem looks like. I mean, you flash back to the early days of the automobile, and you had in the first 10 years, 500 car companies go out of business. It wasn't an indictment of automobiles. It was the fact that running a business is hard. Or you look at something like the .com bubble when it burst. NASDAQ lost 80% of its value. Amazon went from $213 a share to less than $6, a 95% drop. The companies that came out on the other side, they did this, and they did, they grew in size and penetration and success. So yeah, I mean, it's certainly true that it's a tough time at the moment, but these companies are incredibly undervalued. Like the companies that are worth investing in, the investments in Better Meat Company and Masse, in Blue Nalu, like those are really good investments for the investors. And there are a lot of other bargain basement prices for these companies. Impossible is privately held, but it seems to be thriving. Vegetarian Butcher is owned by JBS. They seem to be thriving. And I'm really excited to see Impossible and Beyond and Upside Foods looking, and Vow for that matter, looking at other ways to get add money to the revenue line. So I think that kind of creativity is also a really good sign.
Some people would argue that the GFI has kind of underestimated the role of food culture around meat. You know what I mean? That it's not just a case of once we get to taste and price parity, there'll be this inevitable tipping point, saying that it's more complicated than that, animal meat and so on is a kind of key part of food culture. It's really hard to shift entrenched consumer habits. I kind of agree with that personally, but I'm also seeing evidence every day that eating habits shift quite fundamentally. I mean, we're all eating, hummus and sushi now that, in the US, maybe we weren't 20 years ago. So where do you see that argument around culture? Because we're seeing that a lot also in some of these political kind of moves in the US, that meat alt meat has got embroiled in the culture wars,
Yeah, I mean, I think the concept of alt meats in the culture wars is overblown. It's gotten caught up a little bit, I suppose, in Europe and a little bit in the US. But there aren't any the most prominent Republican to take a stand against alternative meats is Ron DeSantis. He's not, exactly a pinnacle. And the entire conservative establishment, from Reason Magazine to the Cato Institute to National Review to the Dispatch. They're all like, this is entrepreneurship, this is small business, this is consumer choice, this is innovation. So I think oftentimes, especially the media, might be looking for some, let's play up culture war angles, but I'm not sure that's really here. Certainly there's bipartisan.
There's been legislation across a bunch of states and proposed legislation trying to restrict everything from the way that you market plant-based meats to permitting cultivated meat. I mean, that's just a fact, isn't it? There is, and similarly, not really feeling the love from the current administration, RFK Jr. or JD Vance for, I mean, they use terms like fake meat and so on. So I don't know. I'm not really feeling the love.
I haven't heard either of them say that. I've heard the media say that they have said that. Maybe they have, but I will just say the National Cattlemen's Beef Association and the American Meat Institute came out vigorously against the cultivated meat bans. And like they have, yes, I mean, they generally have some cattle ranchers who are in state legislatures who are supportive of it. And then Ron DeSantis was sort of the first mover. He got just roundly attacked. There was an editorial from the publisher of Meeting Place magazine where he called it fascism and said, "How dare you treat us like some endangered turtle in need of protection?" I mean, he would have been he was a culture warrior, and he was sort of attacking DeSantis from the right for doing something so anti-conservative. So I don't know. I mean, we can play those sorts of things up, but I think it has 0% chance of anything happening at the federal level because there's nobody in Congress on either side of the aisle who is championing sort of anti-alt meats, and there are lots of people who are championing pro-alt meats.
I guess the one thing that, I'm loving the relentless optimism, but just going back to, say, the situation in the US, I mean, I get data every month from Sakana that says, meat alternative sales are going down, and we're now back at 2019 levels or something like that. I'm not seeing this. I appreciate you're saying it's not necessarily going to be a hockey stick, maybe the way people were predicting a few years ago, but I'm not even seeing that kind of steady increase, at least in the US market. It feels like, if we think that we're going to head towards this tipping point, it feels like we're actually going in the opposite direction at the moment. I mean, and every plant-based meat company I speak to, I mean, there was, the event you were at recently at Tufts, Mike Messersmith at Lasso, formerly Tender Food, was talking about, if you pick up the phone and say, "Hey, I'm a plant-based meat company trying to raise money," I think he said, the investor's going to say delete, just as a reflexive response these days. So I'm just wondering where this optimism is kind of coming from, at least in the US market.
Well, I do want to take a step back and say that you've read the book, so you know that the book is not relentlessly optimistic.
No. Yeah, it's clear-eyed. Yeah, but I'm still not really personally seeing that kind of, that we're on this trajectory that we're somehow inevitably going to get to this taste and price parity. I just don't see the roadmap for getting there.
Well, I mean, I don't think it's inevitable, or I wouldn't have written the book.
Yes.
And I think the book attempts to be a roadmap for how we get there, and to sort of level set what's true. So, I mean, if you're reading chapter 11, which answers the question, when are we going to have taste and price parity? I say pretty explicitly, we might not.
Yes.
But the science is sufficient. So is this going to be an innovation that dies because of pessimism instead of because of scientific impossibility? So like, I want to have the conversation that we're having, but I also want to say, when I point out that 2019 was still, I think, more than twice the sales of 2016 for plant-based meat. I'm not saying not a problem, that it's down from, its heyday. But it's also not quite the crisis that some people might think it is. And then the other thing that, I think some people thought I was unreasonably mean in my plant-based meat chapter 7, where I pointed out that after Impossible and Beyond were successful, there were like 35 plant-based meat companies that claimed they were the next Impossible or the next Beyond. And they said we're going to have products in 6 to 8 months. It took tens of millions of dollars in research and development from both Beyond and Impossible to get their products to where they are. And it's still the case that 3 out of the 4 products that do, the best are impossible products. So if you are rolling out products that are consistently bad and you're charging too much for them, I think the early optimism assumed that the products would continue to get better and fall in price. And most of the products that were introduced were not any better. They were the next garden burger, not the best.
But if it's going to take, as you say, it takes time and money to develop these innovations. The money, at least, doesn't seem to be there at the moment for companies that do want to.
In 2019, the amount of funding from governments for research and development and scaling outside of the United States was about $650,000 in India. It's now hundreds of millions of dollars a year. 10 years ago, there was literally no scientist on the planet who was getting government money to do alternative protein research. Now it's thousands. The peer-reviewed science papers in this area were, I think, 4 in all of history 10 years ago. In cultivated meat, there were 160 in 2024 alone. The list of similar observations is very, very long. 10 years ago, right now, there was no Impossible Burger or Beyond Burger. And as I mentioned, I think it was just like 4 years ago that those were the only 2 products meat eaters liked at all. So we're making a lot of progress, even in the face of the headwinds that you just laid out. We've still got a long way to go. I mean, with cultivated meat, it's down 99.999%, but that's 2x the cost of production of a burger. And chicken, pork, and aquaculture fish is even less expensive than that. But I interviewed 30 plant-based meat researchers, 30 cultivated meat researchers between like December of 2025 and December of 2024 and May of 2025. And just the level of optimism about the scientific prospects for this were uniformly high. The basic first principles analysis is that it is far more efficient to produce plant-based meat or cultivated meat than to produce conventional meat. And because of that, assuming we bring the will, we will be able to create products that compete on price and taste and in the marketplace. And the meat industry is very enthusiastic about marketing those products if they exist. It makes their lives a lot easier and their profit margins go up. So optimistic, but yeah, I mean, the point of the book is, I wouldn't have written the book if I thought it was inevitable. The point of the book is to say, this is the harm we're solving for. These are the opportunities. This is global outlook. So even if you're pessimistic in the US, look at what's happening in China, look at what's happening in Korea and Israel and Singapore, in the UK and Switzerland and the EU. There's a lot of scientific activity. And 10 years ago, there was nothing, That's how long 10 years is.
You don't change any industry overnight. I just want to ask about the term alternative protein. This always comes up. Was it kind of, in retrospect, a kind of mistake to use that term by kind of making animal protein seem like the kind of default or the benchmark, or is it just we've got to call it something, right?
Yeah, I mean, I try to say plant-based and cultivated meat as much as possible. Rather than saying alternative proteins. There has been a lot of pushback on alternative proteins. It's just, then people come up with green proteins.
Yes.
We do need something to call them. And very open to other alternatives. I think complementary proteins is good. Novel proteins is good. The UN calls them alternatives to animal source foods. That doesn't exactly trip off the tongue. But I don't think any of our struggles are nomenclature based.
If we're sitting here in 5 years' time, what do you think our conversation will be like then?
I mean, the goal of the book, as the conclusion of the book is really focused on saying, yes, we're seeing governments lean in because of food security, food systems resilience, economic competitiveness. Especially countries like China, Korea, Japan, their food self-sufficiency numbers are very bad, and they are incredibly tech forward. I was in an event in Korea, like maybe 6 weeks ago, and the head of AI for the entire country, the president had the ag minister read a statement. The head of the Chamber of Congress spoke. The Speaker of the Parliament spoke. All of them very on fire for alternative proteins and food tech writ large. And the person who ran AI was saying, yes, Korea is not going to compete with China and the US on AI writ large, but we can actually absolutely dominate in food technology. So it does feel to me like we're at sort of a critical time for decision making. We still, we don't have the level of support across the multinationals, across the sort of cause-based people. So things are moving in the right direction, but it's if we continue on sort of the upward trajectory of support, understanding, government support, et cetera, I think we can make a tremendous amount of progress in 5 years. I think we could be at taste parity with a lot of plant-based products. I think we could see the cultivated meat cost of production really falling. I think we could see production infrastructure across both technologies scaling up. But that's all going to require a lot more people being involved and enthusiastic, and the positive upward trajectory that we've seen from governments continuing to trend upward. So that's what I'm trying to, that's what all of us at GFI are trying to support and make happen. But it's not self-executing. So I really do try in the book to be both cautious and optimistic, leaning a little bit maybe on optimistic in a sort of yes, we can, while also saying, but we need you.